Hey, and welcome back to the History of Russia podcast. This is episode 6, Crimean Colonies. Now, before we get started this week, I just wanted to thank Gabul, Mike Hughes, and Scotty PTHFC for the kind reviews on iTunes. I really do enjoy reading your feedback, and it means a lot to me that people are enjoying my efforts. One question that Mike raised is the potential length of the podcast, and I'll cover this in the conclusion of this episode. I apologise that these reviews may have been posted some time ago. I didn't realise that iTunes aggregates reviews by country, and I was only viewing them, those reviews that have been posted in the US, until I widened my search. Now, without further ado, let's get on with today's episode. So, Odessa, Sevastopol, Mariupol, Kherson, what do these places have in common? Well, despite being in modern-day Ukraine, they're not Slavic names, they're actually Greek. Now, the next question you're probably asking, potentially preempting, is that the Greek names because they were originally Greek cities, right? Well, no, not exactly. They're not all actually Greek colonies, but they do have Greek names. This is due to the 18th century Russian nobility's fascination with all things Greek following the conquest of the Crimea and the subsequent Greek and Roman ruins that were rediscovered there. So, Kherson, what's the story there? I was fascinated to read just how old this city is. Kherson, or Kherson as you may see it referred to, what I didn't know is that there were many persecutors to this trading route long before silk travelled upon it from China. For millennia, the nomadic steppe peoples haven't just raided and pillaged along the steppes as I previously thought, but they've long facilitated trade across Eurasia. The second reason is actually food. Even in early antiquity, what is now Ukraine was seen as the breadbasket of Europe, whereas the Greek cities in what is now modern-day Greece relied on the colonies in Sicily and beyond to grow and trade for the wheat that fed the polis back home. The Ionian Greeks, i.e. those Greek cities on the islands of the Ionian Sea and the western coast of modern-day Turkey, relied on the colonies of the Crimea to feed their ever-growing populations. Although sources tell us very little about the people that lived in this city, the archaeology of the city itself actually tells us a surprising amount. We know that in the 4th century BC, as a result of further Sarmatian incursions, but more likely as a result of Rome's increasing power over trade, Macedon and the Seleucid Empire being at war, and the Ptolemaic grain trade from what is now Egypt taking precedence. Again, without sources that explicitly state this is just speculation based on events we know were occurring and potentially having a domino effect on geopolitics of the time. As a result of the Scythio-Sarmatian incursions into territory worryingly close to the city walls, side had help. With Greece in turmoil, Pontus was one of only two feasible allies in the area. For those that aren't aware, and if you know anything about the history of the Roman Republic, I'm sure you're more than aware of who Pontus were due to their conflicts with Rome. For those that aren't aware, it was a kingdom, sometimes referred to as an empire, that was situated on the northern coast of what is now Turkey. It's an interesting state in its own right, as it's a melting pot of both Greek and Persian culture, with the nobility on the coast being mainly Greek, whilst that of the interior was Persian, with the Persian aristocracy being able to trace their roots in some form back to the ancient Achaemenid Empire. At this time, Pontus was expanding fairly rapidly, firstly along the east coast of the Black Sea, and then ever increasingly close to the Roman sphere of influence by taking the western coast of Anatolia, i.e. the western coast of Turkey. The other potential ally was the Bosporan Kingdom, who, despite their name, occupied the area that is now around the eastern edge of the Crimean Peninsula and the Straits of Kerch. Think of the controversial bridge linking Russia to Crimea in modern times. This was at first a coalition of other Greek city colonies that, either through necessity or will of the ruling class, matured from being ruled by a dictator to being a kingdom. Scythian incursions into territory, and sometimes even the city themselves of both Curzon and the Bosporan Kingdom, showed that neither could repel this ever-growing threat. What is known is that compared to other cities that the Goths and afterwards the Huns would ravage, Curzon would escape pretty much unscathed. This, as Vladimir Khadiv alludes to, could have been due to the close ties to a group of peoples called the Crimean Goths, which is a great name for a band. Unlike their more well-known cousins, the Vizi and the Ostrogoths, the Crimean Goths showed little interest in raiding and pillaging the Roman empires, but appear to have stayed in their Crimean homeland and acted as somewhat of a buffer state between the warlike Goths and Huns and the city on the coast. The city comes back into the historical record in the 6th century when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I would bring the city back into the Roman sphere of influence. The city itself and the wider area would always be on the edge of the Byzantine world, acting not just as a mercantile port linking the Western world with the East, but almost as a penal colony for expelled nobility. So feel free to send an email to me directly at the russianhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And if you could spare the time, once again, I would love it if you could leave us a review over on iTunes. Speaking of iTunes, Scott's review querying the length of time it's going to take to complete the podcast. Well, I did map out as far as the 16th century, and I found myself in 2022's calendar, so I stopped. The length of time, however, doesn't really concern me. I've committed to learning about Russian history and sharing my learnings via this podcast, and I'm in it for the long haul. I hope you are too. Next week, we'll see a change of pace. It's time to go Viking. Thanks again.